Close your eyes for a moment and picture this. The year is 1620, the air is cold, the ground is wild, and the land of America is still untamed. You've just stepped off a wooden ship after weeks at sea. Your stomach growls, but there is no bakery, no marketplace, no grocery store waiting for you. Just forests, rivers, and endless soil, raw, unforgiving, yet full of promise. For the first colonists, food was not just about eating, it was survival. Every seed planted, every fish caught, every loaf baked meant the difference between life and death. But what exactly did they eat? How did they grow it, cook it, and share it? And what can their daily meals tell us about life in the 1600s? Today we journey back into colonial America, not through battles or politics, but through the kitchens, the fields, and the fire pits where history was truly lived. This is the story of food in the New World, the struggle, the flavor, and the feast that shaped the very first Americans. The first months in America were not feasts. They were battles against hunger. Colonists often arrived too late in the season to plant proper crops. The soil was unfamiliar, the weather harsh, and the knowledge of local plants was scarce. What they did have was determination and desperation. At first, meals were meager and plain. Salted meats brought from Europe, beef, pork, or fish, often spoiled during the long voyage. Hardened ship's biscuits, tough enough to break a tooth, had to be soaked in water or broth just to be edible. Beer and ale, safer than water on the ship, were rationed carefully. When supplies ran thin, colonists turned to what the land could offer: nuts, berries, wild greens, and roots dug from the forest floor. They gathered mussels, clams, and eels from the rivers and hunted small game like rabbits and squirrels. Sometimes even leather shoes and belts were boiled for broth in the harshest winters. Pause, somber, then shift to hope. But survival was not only about hunger, it was about learning. The colonists soon discovered that indigenous peoples had mastered this land for centuries. They introduced the settlers to vital foods like corn, beans, and squash, crops that would soon become the backbone of colonial diets. Without this knowledge, many would never have lived to see another season. Once the colonists learned to survive the first winters, their greatest challenge became clear. Food had to be grown, not just gathered. Farming was not a choice. It was the heartbeat of survival in the New World. The soil was rich in some places, rocky and stubborn in others. Colonists brought with them seeds from Europe: wheat, barley, rye, and peas. But many crops struggled in the unfamiliar climate. It was indigenous knowledge that turned failure into harvest. Corn, beans, and squash, the three sisters, were taught to the settlers as a system of balance. Corn grew tall, beans climbed the stalks, and squash spread across the ground, keeping weeds and pests at bay. Beyond the fields, kitchen gardens flourished near every cabin. Women tended to herbs like parsley, sage, dill, and thyme, along with onions, carrots, and cabbages. These gardens were not luxuries. They were survival pantries, feeding families through harsh winters. But farming was backbreaking. Wooden plows, simple hoes, and sheer muscle turned earth under the hot sun. Every harvest was uncertain, threatened by storms, insects, or drought. Yet, season after season, the fields began to feed the colonies, transforming desperation into hope. It was in these furrows and gardens that the first true taste of colonial America was born. Not just survival food, but a foundation for a new way of life. Even with crops in the soil, the colonists could not rely on farming alone. The forests, rivers, and coastlines became their second pantry, wild, dangerous, and rich with life. Hunting was essential. Deer, wild turkey, rabbits, and even bears provided fresh meat for families. Guns were scarce at first, so bows, traps, and sheer patience were often the tools of survival. Every successful hunt meant food for the table, hides for clothing, and bones for tools. Fishing was another lifeline. Colonists caught cod, bass, and trout from rivers and the sea, while shellfish like oysters, mussels, and clams were gathered in baskets along the shores. Smoking and salting preserved the catch, ensuring food would last through the colder months. Gathering, too, played a role. Berries, nuts, wild apples, and herbs were foraged from the forests. Honey from wild beehives sweetened their meals, and maple sap, taught to them by indigenous peoples, became a treasured source of sugar. But the wilderness was never without danger. Colonists risked encounters with wolves, storms, and even starvation when hunts failed. Still, the land provided, if one knew where and how to look. In the hunt, the fishnet, and the basket, survival became tradition. Cooking methods and tools. Farming and hunting filled the larders, but survival meant more than raw ingredients. It meant turning them into meals. Colonial cooking was simple, resourceful, and deeply tied to fire. In nearly every cabin, the hearth was the heart of the home. A massive fireplace wasn't just for warmth, it was the kitchen itself. Iron pots hung on hooks over open flames, and skillets balanced on tripods. Bread was baked in clay or brick ovens, while flat cakes of cornmeal were cooked on hot stones or in cast iron pans. Cooking tools were few but precious. Wooden spoons, ladles, and trenchers served daily needs. Mortars and pestles ground grains into flour, while butter churns transformed milk into golden pats of fat for cooking. Knives, kettles, and spits turned wild game into roasts. Every meal was flavored by fire. Smoke seeped into bread, stews, and salted meats. Ashes were sometimes even used in recipes, blending survival with creativity. Nothing was wasted. Bones became broth, fat was rendered into lard, and herbs from the kitchen garden added both flavor and medicine. Though simple by today's standards, these meals carried the taste of survival, of family gathered around the hearth, and of resilience in the face of hardship. To cook in colonial America was not just to prepare food, it was to keep hope alive. Daily meals and recipes. What did a typical day of eating look like in colonial America? The meals were far simpler than what we know today, but they carried the weight of survival and tradition. Breakfast was often the most modest meal, bread with butter or porridge made from cornmeal, oats, or rye. Sometimes a mug of cider or ale accompanied it, since fresh water was not always safe. Children and adults alike started their mornings with hearty grains, enough to fuel hours of labor in fields and kitchens. Dinner, served at midday, was the main meal of the day. Stews were common, a mix of beans, peas, and root vegetables, simmered slowly over the hearth. When meat was available, it was added in small amounts to stretch the flavor across the pot. Cornbread, johnny cakes, and sometimes wheat bread filled the table. Supper, eaten in the evening, was lighter. Leftovers from dinner, cold meat, bread, and perhaps milk or cheese made the meal simple but filling. In wealthier households, pies filled with apples, berries, or meat showed up more often, flavored with spices imported from abroad. Some recipes became colonial staples. Hasty pudding, a cornmeal porridge cooked with milk, was common across households. Succotash, a mixture of corn and beans, came directly from indigenous traditions, and salt pork, baked beans, and hearty stews carried families through long winters. Each meal may have seemed plain, but together they formed a rhythm of survival. Bread and broth, grains and garden, stretching what was scarce into something that could sustain life. It was food as necessity, but also food as comfort. Imported foods and trade influence. Not all food in colonial America came from the soil or the hunt. From the very beginning, trade and import shaped what colonists ate. The Atlantic Ocean was not a barrier, it was a lifeline. Ships from Europe carried wheat flour, sugar, spices, tea, and coffee, luxuries that only the wealthy could afford. Barrels of molasses from the Caribbean sweetened colonial kitchens and laid the foundation for rum. Exotic spices, cinnamon, nutmeg, pepper, and cloves traveled across oceans to flavor pies, puddings, and roasts. Imports were expensive, unreliable, and often spoiled before arriving. Yet for those who could buy them, these goods added prestige and variety to their meals. A loaf of fine white bread or a cup of sweetened tea was not just food, it was a statement of wealth and status. For the common colonist, imported food was rare, but trade still touched every table. Salt and dried fish from New England were shipped south. Corn, pork, and tobacco moved between colonies. Slowly, a web of exchange tied the settlements together, blending survival food with the beginnings of a global economy. Through these imports, colonial diets were never just local. They were connected to distant lands, to empires, and to the tides of trade that shaped the world. Feasts, holidays, and social meals. Food was survival in the colonies, but at times it was also celebration. When the harvest was gathered, when a wedding was held, or when a holy day arrived, meals transformed into feasts, moments where scarcity gave way to abundance. The most famous of these is the 1621 Harvest Feast in Plymouth, later remembered as the First Thanksgiving. Colonists and indigenous peoples shared roasted venison, wild fowl, fish, corn, beans, squash, and berries. It was not yet turkey and pie as we know it, but it was a symbol of survival and community. Throughout the colonies, holidays and church gatherings meant tables heavy with food. Roasted meats, pies stuffed with apples or mincemeat, puddings flavored with molasses, and mugs of cider or ale brought warmth and unity. Music, prayer, and laughter filled the air alongside the smell of hearth fires. Even simple neighbors' gatherings carried meaning. Sharing bread, trading recipes, or helping one another during harvest made food not only nourishment, but connection. In a land where winters were harsh and life uncertain, these feasts became anchors of hope. In the feast, colonists found not just sustenance, but joy, proof that even in hardship, life could still be celebrated. Poor versus wealthy colonists' diet. Not every colonist ate the same meal. Food on the frontier was shaped not only by survival, but also by wealth and class. For poor families and small farmers, the diet was plain and repetitive. Cornbread, porridge, beans, and stews made from vegetables or scraps of salted pork filled their tables. Meat was rare, sugar a luxury, and spices almost unheard of. Every bite was stretched, every loaf made to last. For them, food was fuel, survival in its most basic form. But for the wealthy, meals looked very different. Plantation owners, merchants, and colonial elites could afford imported goods and fine dining. White wheat bread, roasted meats, pies flavored with cinnamon and nutmeg, wine, and even imported chocolate appeared on their tables. Their kitchens had servants, their tables heavy with silverware, and their meals displayed their power as much as their wealth. The difference was stark. One family eating broth by the fire in a small cabin, another feasting on spiced roasts and sweet puddings in a candlelit hall. Both lived in the same colony, but their worlds of food could not have been further apart. Food in colonial America was never just nourishment. It was a mirror of class, survival, and status. Happy, attractive note. From the first desperate winters to the abundant harvest feasts, food shaped every part of colonial life. It was more than meals on a table. It was survival, community, and tradition. Each loaf of bread, each ear of corn, each stew simmering in a hearth pot carried the story of struggle and resilience. The colonists learned from the land and from indigenous peoples, blending old world ingredients with new world crops. They built gardens, smoked fish, roasted game, and traded across oceans. Out of hardship, they created a cuisine that was plain but powerful, a cuisine that fed generations and laid the foundation of what would one day become American food. So when we think of colonial America, it is not only ships, battles, or politics that defined them. It was also the family gathered around a simple wooden table, sharing bread, broth, and laughter. In their food, they found life. And in their life, they found hope.